The Caldwell brothers harbored a secret that would shock even the most liberal of communities. Their unconventional arrangement with one shared wife became the whispered scandal that tore through their small town until death finally ended their disturbing arrangement. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Mapleton, Pennsylvania, 1976. A place where golden cornfields stretched as far as the eye could see, swaying gently in the summer breeze. In this tight-knit farming community, everyone knew their neighbor's business, or at least thought they did. Pickup trucks with dusty license plates rolled down Main Street, country music spilling from open windows as farmers nodded respectful greetings to one another. Life moved at its own unhurried pace here. Weekdays were marked by the rhythm of agricultural labor, while Sundays found most families gathered at Grace Lutheran Church, their best clothes pressed and their children scrubbed clean. Pastor Miller's sermons echoed through the white-walled sanctuary, followed by potluck lunches where housewives compared recipes and men discussed crop yields. Thomas Caldwell and his younger brother Robert maintained their sprawling family farm just 4 miles outside town. The property had been in their family for 3 generations, its boundaries marked by weathered wooden fences that seemed to warn visitors away rather than simply denote property lines. Thomas, with his imposing frame and penetrating gaze, commanded respect whenever he ventured into town for supplies. The elder Caldwell brother spoke little but carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew his place in the world. Between the brothers stood Catherine Caldwell, Thomas's wife of 15 years. When she appeared at community gatherings, Catherine's warm smile and homemade pies won admiration, though few could claim to know her well. She moved through social situations with practiced grace, her attentive eyes missing nothing while revealing little. The Caldwells keep to themselves, locals would remark to newcomers, their tone suggesting this was both observation and warning. Children were told not to cut across Caldwell land on their way to the swimming hole, even though it would save nearly a mile of walking. When asked why, parents offered vague explanations about respecting privacy or the dangers of farm equipment. Behind these gentle deflections lay whispered rumors that circulated in Mapleton's beauty parlor and at the counter of Donovan's hardware store. Some said Thomas ruled his household with an iron fist. Others noticed how Catherine's gaze lingered on Robert in ways that seemed inappropriate for a sister-in-law. The farmhands hired during harvest season never lasted more than 1 season, and none would speak about their experiences there. The Caldwell farm stood as an island unto itself, prosperous, immaculate, and somehow forbidding. Its red barn and white farmhouse might have featured on a postcard of rural American life, yet something indefinable kept the community at a distance. Unspoken rules governed interactions with the family, rules that everyone in Mapleton instinctively understood but never articulated. No one could have guessed that this carefully maintained distance would soon be shattered by the arrival of Janice Holbrook, whose innocent dreams would collide fatally with the Caldwells' hidden reality. The Caldwell farmhouse stood at the end of a winding dirt road, its white clapboard exterior weathered by decades of Pennsylvania seasons. Inside those walls, a delicate balance of power had been maintained for years, invisible to outsiders, but rigidly understood by those who lived there. Thomas Caldwell, the elder brother, commanded the family's 500 acres with the same authority he wielded over the dinner table. At 47, his weathered hands bore the calluses of a lifetime of labor, and local farmers knew better than to challenge his decisions at agricultural meetings. When Thomas entered a room, conversations quieted. His unyielding gaze could wither crops and resolve disputes without a word spoken. Robert existed in the negative space his brother left behind. Younger by 3 years, he moved through the farm with quiet efficiency, preferring the company of livestock to people. While Thomas handled business and negotiations, Robert maintained equipment and tended to the more delicate aspects of farming. The brothers functioned like a well-oiled machine, their complementary skills making the Caldwell operation one of the most productive in the county. At the center of this careful arrangement was Catherine Caldwell. Officially Thomas's wife of 15 years, she orchestrated the household with precision that matched her husband's field operations. Her apple pies won ribbons at the county fair, and her Sunday dresses were always pressed to perfection for church services at Grace Lutheran. Neighbors admired her ability to manage such a large household while maintaining her cheerful disposition. But those who looked closely noticed how Catherine's warm smile never quite reached her eyes. They might observe how she positioned herself between the brothers at community gatherings, her fingers occasionally brushing Robert's arm when Thomas looked away. The farmhands whispered about how she delivered lunch to both men in the fields, spending extra minutes with the younger brother, while Thomas was occupied elsewhere. The Caldwell dining room hosted Sunday dinners where Catherine served roast beef and potatoes on her grandmother's china. Thomas sat at the head of the table, Robert to his right, Catherine to his left, a triangle of unspoken rules and careful glances. When visitors joined these meals, they often left with an unsettled feeling they couldn't quite name. Local gossip occasionally touched on the unusual household, but most attributed any oddities to the eccentricities common in farming families. Few suspected the true nature of the arrangement behind the Caldwell's front door, a delicate ecosystem of control, submission, and shared intimacy that would eventually crack under pressure when Janice Holbrook entered their carefully constructed world. Janice Holbrook clutched the steering wheel of her blue Ford Pinto, humming along to Fleetwood Mac on the radio as cornfields blurred past her window. The 23-year-old had graduated from Harrisburg Community College just 3 months earlier, her teaching certificate tucked proudly in her bedroom drawer. Mapleton Elementary had offered her a position starting in January, and the thought made her heart swell with possibility. She still remembered the day she met Robert Caldwell at the Mapleton Summer Fair. She had been helping at her friend's lemonade stand when the quiet farmer approached, his shy smile revealing a warmth that contradicted his reserved demeanor. Their conversation flowed easily despite his initial awkwardness, and by sunset, he had asked to see her again. Their courtship progressed with a gentle predictability that Janice found comforting. Robert would drive into Harrisburg every Wednesday evening in his pickup, taking her to simple dinners or walks along the river. He spoke little of his family, only mentioning that he worked the farm with his brother Thomas and Thomas's wife Catherine. When he proposed after 4 months with a modest ring, Janice didn't hesitate to say yes. "You'll love Catherine," Robert had told her, his voice carrying an odd note she couldn't quite place. "She runs the household perfectly. Thomas says we couldn't manage without her." Walter and Linda Holbrook had expressed concerns about their daughter's whirlwind romance. "You hardly know his family, honey," her mother had cautioned over the telephone from their Florida retirement home. But Janice dismissed their worries with the confidence of youth. On September 3rd, Janice packed an overnight bag, telling her roommate she'd be back by midnight the next day. She had visited the Caldwell property twice before, but never stayed overnight. This time would be different. Catherine had specifically invited her to dinner to get to know the newest Caldwell woman, as the handwritten invitation phrased it. As her vehicle turned onto the long gravel driveway leading to the farmhouse, Janice noticed how isolated the property truly was. The main house stood imposing against the afternoon sky, its windows like watchful eyes. In the distance, Thomas worked a tractor across the field, his straight back a silhouette against the setting sun. Catherine Caldwell emerged onto the porch before Janice could even turn off the engine. Her welcoming smile seemed practiced, her eyes calculating as they swept over the young teacher's appearance. "You're right on time," Catherine called, descending the steps with graceful authority. "Robert's finishing chores in the barn. Come in, I've made sweet tea." Janice followed her future sister-in-law into the house, admiring the immaculate interior. She failed to notice how Catherine locked the door behind them, or how the older woman's gaze lingered on her with an unsettling mixture of assessment and possession. The evening of September 3rd began with golden light streaming through the Caldwell farmhouse windows. Janice Holbrook arrived just before sunset, her blue Ford Pinto kicking up dust along the gravel driveway. She had carefully applied her favorite perfume and wore a new yellow dress that complemented her auburn hair. Small efforts to impress the family she hoped to join. Before leaving her apartment in Harrisburg, Janice had scribbled a quick note to her roommate. "Meeting Robert's family tonight. Should be back by midnight. Don't wait up." The handwritten message, penned with excitement, would later become the last confirmed communication from the young woman. Inside the farmhouse, Catherine Caldwell had prepared a special dinner. She moved gracefully between kitchen and dining room, serving pot roast while maintaining her perfect hostess smile. Thomas sat at the head of the table, his stern gaze evaluating their guest between forkfuls of food. Robert barely touched his meal, his eyes darting nervously between his brother and his fiancée. As night fell, the conversation shifted. What began as polite small talk about Janice's teaching aspirations gradually transformed into something more intense. Questions became interrogations. Thomas pressed about her family's background, her future plans, her expectations of married life. Catherine watched silently, her warm demeanor cooling with each passing hour. What happened after dessert remains unclear. Neighbors would later report hearing raised voices around 9 o'clock, though none could distinguish words. By 10, the farmhouse lights dimmed one by one. Janice's vehicle remained parked beside the barn until sometime before dawn, when it mysteriously disappeared. When midnight came and went with no sign of her, Janice's roommate felt only mild concern. By morning, worry had bloomed into panic. She called Janice's parents, who immediately contacted authorities. The aspiring teacher had vanished without a trace. Detective Wayne Reynolds arrived at the Caldwell farm by noon the next day. The brothers presented a united front, claiming Janice had left after a minor disagreement about wedding plans. "She was upset," Thomas explained firmly. "Drove off around 10. Robert nodded in silent agreement, though his trembling hands betrayed his nervousness. By evening, Mapleton's telephone lines buzzed with speculation. The town that prided itself on knowing everyone's business suddenly realized how little they truly knew about the Caldwell household. Walter and Linda Holbrook arrived from Florida the following day, their faces etched with desperation as they distributed hastily printed flyers bearing their daughter's smiling face. For Janice's parents, the nightmare had just begun. For the Caldwells, a carefully constructed facade was starting to crack, revealing shadows none in Mapleton had dared to acknowledge. Detective Wayne Reynolds pulled up to the Caldwell farm in his police-issued vehicle, dust billowing behind him on the gravel driveway. As a lifelong Mapleton resident, he knew the property well, though he'd never had reason to visit professionally until now. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its weathered siding and sturdy frame a testament to generations of Caldwell's stubbornness. Thomas Caldwell met him at the door, his unyielding gaze sizing up the detective before extending a firm handshake. "We've got nothing to hide here," he stated, leading Wayne into the living room, where Catherine was arranging coffee cups on a tray. "I've made some fresh coffee," Catherine said, her smile warm and practiced as she poured the steaming liquid. "Sugar? Cream?" The homemaker's hospitality seemed perfectly normal, as if they were discussing crop prices rather than a missing woman. Wayne accepted the cup with a nod. "I need to ask about Janice Holbrook's visit here Tuesday evening. She and Robert had a disagreement," Thomas explained, leaning forward in his chair. "Nothing serious. She left around 8, said she needed time to think." The detective noticed how Thomas answered for everyone, establishing the narrative before anyone else could speak. "And you saw her leave?" "From the window," the elder Caldwell confirmed. "She seemed upset, but not distraught." Catherine nodded along, her hand resting briefly on her husband's arm. "These young couples, they have their spats. I told Robert not to worry." Wayne turned his attention to Robert Caldwell, who sat in the corner chair, fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on his shirt cuff. The younger brother's face was pale, his eyes downcast. "Robert, can you tell me what happened?" "We argued about—" Robert hesitated, glancing quickly at Catherine before continuing. "About wedding plans. She wanted something bigger than we could afford." Wayne jotted notes in his small notebook. "And she left at 8, you said?" 8:30. Robert corrected, then froze as Thomas shot him a sharp look. "Around 8, Thomas interjected firmly. "Time gets fuzzy when you're upset." The detective's instincts flared at the discrepancy. Did anyone call to check if she arrived home safely? Catherine smoothly inserted herself into the conversation. "I suggested it, but Robert thought she needed space. Isn't that right, dear?" Robert nodded mechanically, his gaze fixed on the floor. As Wayne continued his questioning, he observed the subtle dynamics, how Catherine positioned herself between the brothers, how Thomas commanded the room, how Robert seemed to shrink with each passing minute. The younger Caldwell's account contained small contradictions about where they argued, what Janice had been wearing, which direction her automobile had headed. When Wayne finally stood to leave, he felt certain of one thing. Beneath the veneer of normalcy in this household, something was terribly wrong. 4 days after Janice Holbrook's disappearance, the cool autumn breeze carried laughter across the abandoned quarry. 3 local teenagers, skipping school to explore the forbidden swimming hole, spotted something glinting beneath the murky water. What began as an adventure turned into horror when they realized they were looking at a submerged vehicle. Sheriff's deputies arrived within the hour, and divers confirmed what everyone feared. It was Janice's blue Ford Pinto. The automobile was carefully winched from the water, its blue paint now dulled with silt and algae. Detective Wayne Reynolds stood silently as water poured from the vehicle's interior, his experienced eyes already cataloging details. "Nobody touch anything," he ordered, as the car settled on solid ground. Inside, they found Janice's purse resting undisturbed on the passenger seat, as if she had simply stepped away momentarily. The detective carefully examined the contents. Her wallet with $37 still inside, a tube of lipstick, and most tellingly, receipts from a gas station and diner dated September 3rd, the very night she vanished. What puzzled Reynolds most was the location. The quarry sat less than 2 miles from the Caldwell property, down an unmarked dirt road few outsiders knew about. Local kids used it for swimming in summer months, but it remained largely forgotten by adults. Yet somehow, Janice's car had ended up perfectly centered in the deepest part. "Could she have driven here herself?" asked a young deputy. Reynolds shook his head. "The keys aren't in the ignition. And look at those tire tracks leading to the edge. Straight as an arrow, no signs of braking." By afternoon, the news had spread through Mapleton like wildfire. Curious onlookers gathered behind the police tape, whispering theories. Walter and Linda Holbrook arrived, their faces masks of anguish as they identified their daughter's belongings. When Reynolds returned to question the Caldwell brothers that evening, their reactions spoke volumes. Thomas Caldwell appeared genuinely surprised about the quarry's location, his weathered face betraying nothing but mild concern. Robert, however, turned ghostly pale at the mention of the quarry, his hands trembling as he clutched a coffee mug. "You never thought to mention this quarry during our previous conversations?" Reynolds asked pointedly. "We haven't been there since we were boys," Thomas answered smoothly. Hardly seemed relevant. Catherine Caldwell stood in the doorway, her watchful eyes never leaving Robert as he stammered agreement with his brother. What troubled Reynolds most as he drove away from the farm that night wasn't just the brothers' selective memory. It was the fact that Robert's work boots, hastily hidden beneath the porch steps, were caked with the distinctive red clay found only at the quarry's edge. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Mapleton, as residents gathered at Grace Lutheran Church, determination etched on their faces. Sheriff Donovan had organized search parties to comb through the surrounding countryside for any sign of Janice Holbrook. Maps were spread across folding tables, areas marked off in grids, and volunteers signed up for different sectors. Robert Caldwell stood at the edge of the crowd, his tall frame hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. He barely spoke, nodding mechanically when addressed. The young farmer's hollow eyes betrayed sleepless nights, darting nervously whenever Janice's name was mentioned. He joined the Eastern search party, trudging through cornfields where golden stalks whispered secrets in the October breeze. "Robert seems destroyed by all this," whispered Martha Jenkins to her husband as they watched him methodically search through a ditch. "Poor boy can barely put one foot in front of the other." Thomas remained conspicuously absent. The elder Caldwell had curtly informed the sheriff he couldn't spare time from the harvest, though everyone knew the corn could wait another day. His absence raised eyebrows among the townspeople, but few dared voice their suspicions about the respected farmer. Back at the Caldwell farmhouse, Catherine moved with practiced efficiency. Her kitchen became a production line of comfort food: apple pies, pumpkin bread, and thermoses of hot coffee. She arrived at the church hall with baskets laden with baked goods, her smile warm and concerned as she distributed sustenance to the weary searchers. "You're an angel, Catherine," Linda Holbrook said, accepting a steaming cup. Janice's mother looked years older than she had just days before, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Catherine squeezed the woman's shoulder. "We're all praying for Janice," she replied, her voice perfectly modulated to convey the right balance of hope and concern. Robert is beside himself with worry. While serving refreshments, Catherine's ears remained alert, catching snippets of conversation. When Detective Reynolds mentioned expanding the search toward the abandoned quarry, she casually drifted closer, offering him a slice of pie while absorbing every detail of his plans. Day after day, the searches continued. Flyers with Janice's smiling face appeared on every telephone pole and store window. Robert returned each evening covered in dirt and burrs, his clothes soaked with sweat despite the cool weather. He would collapse into a kitchen chair, avoiding Thomas's stern gaze while Catherine silently placed food before him. As October deepened, hope began to fade like the daylight. The search parties grew smaller, the conversations more hushed, yet Catherine remained vigilant, her pastries and sympathetic smiles masking the watchful calculation behind her eyes. A sentry guarding the terrible secret that bound the Caldwell household in its suffocating embrace. Walter and Linda Holbrook arrived in Mapleton with their hearts hanging by a thread. The retired couple had driven 18 hours straight from their modest home in Florida, stopping only for gas and bitter coffee that did nothing to wash away their fear. Their daughter's disappearance had hollowed them out, leaving only determination in the void where peace once lived. She would never just leave, Walter insisted to anyone who would listen, his weathered hands trembling as he stapled another flyer to a telephone pole. Janice had plans. She was starting her teaching career here. The Holbrooks took a room at the only motel in town, transforming it into an impromptu command center. Maps of Mapleton covered the walls, red circles marking areas already searched. Linda spent hours on the motel's phone, calling Janice's college friends, distant relatives, anyone who might have heard from her daughter. 3 days after their arrival, Catherine Caldwell appeared at their door with a casserole dish and a practiced smile of concern. The farmer's wife was impeccably dressed, despite the early hour, her charm working its way into the cramped motel room along with the aroma of home-cooked food. "You poor dears must be exhausted," she said, placing the dish on the small table. "The whole town is just devastated about your daughter." Linda noticed how Catherine's eyes scanned every detail of their temporary residence. The flyers, the maps, the list of people they'd spoken with. Nothing escaped her attention. "Robert is simply beside himself," Catherine continued. referring to her brother-in-law with a strange proprietary tone. He cared for Janice very deeply. Walter asked bluntly about the night their daughter disappeared. Catherine's answers were smooth and rehearsed, matching Thomas's account perfectly. Too perfectly, Linda thought. As Catherine prepared to leave, she paused at the door and placed a hand on Linda's arm. "Try not to worry too much. Sometimes girls want more than they can handle. They run when things get complicated." The comment lodged itself in Linda's mind like a splinter. Long after Catherine had gone, those words echoed in her thoughts. What had Janice been handling? What complications would make her run? That evening, Detective Wayne Reynolds visited with updates that offered no comfort. The local man's frustration was evident as he admitted they had no new leads. "The Caldwells are respected here," he explained carefully, "but I promise you, I'm looking at everyone." Linda caught the detective's subtle emphasis on everyone and wondered if he shared her growing unease about Catherine's solicitous attention and Thomas's rigid accounts. But most troubling was Robert's absence. The man who supposedly loved their daughter had yet to look them in the eyes. As darkness fell over Mapleton, the Holbrooks clung to hope while feeling increasingly entangled in the Caldwell family's strange, suffocating orbit. Winter descended upon Mapleton with a vengeance, blanketing the Pennsylvania countryside in pristine white. The search for Janice Holbrook gradually faded like the flyers posted around town, their edges curling and colors washing away beneath the relentless snow and ice. 3 months had passed since her disappearance, and the case that once consumed the small community had begun to slip from daily conversation. On Christmas Eve, Grace Lutheran Church glowed with candlelight as families gathered for midnight mass. Detective Wayne Reynolds watched from the back pew as the Caldwell family entered, their presence causing a subtle ripple through the congregation. Thomas Caldwell stood tall and unaffected, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he nodded curtly to acquaintances. Catherine moved gracefully beside him, her smile warm as she greeted fellow parishioners, a picture of rural dignity in her best winter coat. It was Robert who drew the detective's attention. The younger Caldwell brother seemed to have withered since autumn, his frame thinner and his complexion ashen. He moved like a man sleepwalking, responding mechanically when addressed. The investigator noted how Catherine subtly guided him with a hand on his elbow, positioning herself between the brothers as they took their seats. After the service, Reynolds observed the family from his vehicle, parked across the street. The way Thomas gripped his younger brother's shoulder as they walked to their automobile seemed less brotherly and more possessive. The detective started his car, but didn't immediately drive away. Instead, he pulled out a small leather-bound notebook he'd recently purchased and made his first entry. Back at his modest home, while his wife slept, Reynolds continued writing by lamplight. He documented the inconsistencies in the brothers' statements, Catherine's calculated warmth, and the strange dynamic he'd witnessed between them. He sketched a rough map of the Caldwell property, marking the distance to the quarry where Janice's car had been found. The holidays passed, and January brought bitter cold. Walter and Linda Holbrook returned to Florida, their hope diminishing with each passing day. They'd left behind a box of their daughter's belongings with Reynolds, who promised to continue investigating. Among the items was a photograph of Janice and Robert at the summer fair where they'd met, her smile radiant, his eyes looking not at her, but somewhere beyond the camera's frame. As frost patterns formed on Mapleton's windows, Reynolds added to his notebook nightly. He was building a case on instinct alone, knowing it might never see a courtroom. "Something isn't right in that household," he wrote one evening. "The way they move around each other, like planets in a warped orbit. What gravity holds them together? And what happened when Janice threatened that balance?" As the frost retreated and wildflowers dotted the Pennsylvania countryside, Mapleton found itself awash in a new season of speculation. Spring always brought gossip as reliably as it brought rain. But this year, The whispers centered on the Caldwell farm with renewed intensity. "Have you noticed Robert Caldwell hasn't been to town in nearly 3 months?" Margaret Wilson murmured to her friend over coffee at the local diner. The younger Caldwell brother had become something of a phantom, glimpsed only at a distance, working the fields, but never venturing beyond the property line. What drew even more attention were Catherine Caldwell's public interactions with her brother-in-law. At the annual spring festival, several townsfolk observed how she placed her hand possessively on Robert's arm, steering him away from conversations with other women. When Elaine Peterson, a young widow, approached him with a basket of homemade preserves, Catherine materialized between them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "She watches him like a hawk," Harold Jenkins commented to Detective Wayne Reynolds during their weekly chess game at the park. "Not like family should, more like, well, I don't rightly know what to call it." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully, mentally adding this observation to the growing collection in his private notebook. The detective had been piecing together the strange dynamics of the Caldwell household for months, but concrete evidence remained elusive. Meanwhile, Thomas Caldwell's authoritarian presence in town continued undiminished. He conducted business with his usual stern efficiency, never acknowledging the curious glances or abrupt silences that followed his entrance into the feed store or bank. The most troubling rumors came from Doris Matheson, who cleaned houses for several prominent Mapleton families. While serving at a dinner party hosted by the Caldwells, she'd observed peculiar seating arrangements and bedroom configurations that suggested arrangements beyond conventional marriage. "They have rules," she confided to her sister. "Strange ones. Catherine sits between the brothers at every meal. Thomas speaks first, always, and Robert, he looks at Catherine the way a man looks at his wife, not his sister-in-law." Yet for all the speculation, most residents ultimately shrugged off these oddities. Rural communities had always harbored eccentric families, they reasoned. The Caldwells kept to themselves, paid their taxes, and contributed generously to local causes. What happened behind their farmhouse doors was their business. Walter and Linda Holbrook, still residing temporarily in town while searching for their daughter, heard these whispers too. Linda found herself watching Catherine with increasing unease during their encounters, noting how the woman's charm never faltered, yet somehow felt increasingly mechanical. "There's something not right in that house," Linda told her husband one evening, "and I can't help thinking Janice sensed it too." Detective Wayne Reynolds tapped his pen against his notepad as he reviewed his observations from the past 5 months of investigating Janice Holbrook's disappearance. A pattern had emerged that he couldn't ignore, something subtle yet profoundly disturbing about the dynamics within the Caldwell household. Every time he questioned the family, Catherine Caldwell positioned herself physically between the two brothers. At first, it seemed like the natural stance of a concerned wife and sister-in-law, but Reynolds now recognized it as something more calculated. The detective had noticed how she would place a gentle hand on Robert's arm whenever his voice wavered, or how she would finish Thomas's sentences when the conversation approached sensitive topics. "She's the conductor," Reynolds muttered to himself as he added another note to his growing file. "And they're playing by her rules." During their 4th interview, the detective had deliberately separated them, speaking to Robert alone in the barn. The younger Caldwell brother had stammered, eyes constantly darting toward the farmhouse where Catherine watched from the window. Within minutes, she had appeared with a pitcher of lemonade, inserting herself smoothly into the conversation. "Robert gets so nervous with official matters," she had explained, with that warm smile that never quite reached her eyes. "He's always been the sensitive one." The detective observed how Thomas deferred to his wife in subtle ways, a glance seeking approval before answering questions, the slight pause before speaking as if mentally checking his response against some invisible standard. For a man who commanded respect throughout Mapleton with his stern demeanor, this subtle submission spoke volumes. Robert's deference was even more pronounced. The younger brother seemed unable to function independently in Catherine's presence, as if she were the source of his courage and his words. Reynolds had seen similar dynamics in his 20 years of police work, but never quite like this. A woman holding two grown men in such perfect balance, like planets locked in orbit around a controlling sun. Most disturbing was how Catherine maintained this control without ever appearing domineering. To casual observers, she was simply the perfect farmer's wife, supportive, charming, and attentive. But Reynolds saw the calculated nature of her movements, the way she monitored every exchange, the subtle signals she sent that redirected conversations away from dangerous territory. "It's like watching a chess master," Reynolds told his empty office. "She's always 3 moves ahead." The detective was becoming convinced that whatever happened to Janice Holbrook, Catherine Caldwell was not merely a witness or bystander. She was the keystone of a carefully constructed arrangement, one that the young teacher had somehow threatened, perhaps without even realizing it. By late summer of 1977, the Caldwell farm stood as a testament to prosperity in Mapleton. Golden wheat fields stretched toward the horizon, and the barn overflowed with a bountiful harvest. Thomas Caldwell had secured contracts with 3 new distributors, bringing unprecedented wealth to the family property. From the outside, the Caldwells appeared to be living the American dream. Inside the farmhouse, however, a different reality festered. Robert Caldwell grew increasingly withdrawn, his shoulders perpetually hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. At night, he would wake drenched in sweat, muttering Janice's name, before Catherine could silence him with a firm hand on his shoulder. The younger brother's once gentle eyes had become vacant, his movements mechanical as he performed his daily chores. Catherine maintained her carefully crafted facade, serving hearty meals and managing the household with practiced efficiency. Yet her vigilance never wavered. She positioned herself between the brothers during meals, controlling conversations with subtle redirections whenever Robert's gaze drifted too far into memory. "You need to pull yourself together," she whispered to him one evening while Thomas inspected the barn. "People are starting to notice." The fragile balance of their arrangement began showing cracks that even Catherine couldn't smooth over. Thomas grew increasingly irritable, snapping at farmhands and spending longer hours in the fields, anywhere away from his brother's haunted presence. One humid evening, as crickets chirped in the tall grass, Elijah Parker, a seasonal worker hired for the harvest, was stacking hay bales behind the main barn when he overheard the brothers' voices carrying through an open window. "You'll ruin everything if you keep talking in your sleep," Thomas hissed, his normally commanding voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Do you understand what's at stake here? Everything we've built could disappear overnight." Robert's response was too quiet to hear, but the sharp sound of something, perhaps a fist, hitting wooden furniture made Elijah flinch. "She keeps us together," Thomas continued. "Remember that. Without Catherine, we're nothing." Elijah froze, the hay hook suspended in midair. Though he'd only been working at the farm for 3 weeks, he understood the unspoken hierarchy of Mapleton. The Caldwell family's influence extended beyond their property lines, reaching into the town council, the church board, and even the local police department. The farmhand quietly finished his task and slipped away, the conversation locked away in his memory. He told no one, not his wife, not his drinking buddies at the local tavern. Some secrets weren't worth the risk of crossing the powerful Caldwell family. By the next harvest season, Elijah had found work 2 counties away. The memory of that night fading like summer heat, giving way to fall. The winter of '77 brought bitter winds to the Caldwell farm. Robert Caldwell sat alone in the hayloft, shivering, not from cold, but from the weight of secrets. The barn creaked around him as he pulled a wrinkled notepad from his jacket pocket. His hands trembled as he pressed pen to paper, the guilt of 7 months finally breaking through his carefully maintained facade. "I never wanted her gone. Thomas said we had to." The words flowed painfully, each letter a confession that could destroy everything. Janice just wanted to leave. She found Catherine in my bed. She was going to tell everyone about us. His pen paused, tears blurring his vision. Thomas grabbed her. I should have stopped him. The younger Caldwell folded the paper carefully, sliding it into an envelope alongside a small gold locket, the one he'd given Janice during their third date at the county fair. She'd had worn it proudly, never suspecting the twisted arrangement she was entering. Robert sealed the envelope with shaking fingers, pressing it against his chest before hiding it beneath a loose floorboard in his bedroom. For 3 days, the confession remained hidden. Robert walked through his chores like a ghost, avoiding Thomas's scrutinizing gaze and Catherine's knowing smiles. The farm wife noticed his distraction, how he flinched when Thomas entered a room, how he avoided the path to the tool shed. On the 4th day, while Robert worked the fields, Catherine entered his bedroom. She knew every corner of the farmhouse, every hiding place. Her intuition had kept their unusual arrangement functioning for years. Within minutes, her fingers discovered the loose board and the damning envelope beneath. Catherine sat on Robert's bed, reading the confession with narrowed eyes. The locket dangled from her fingers, catching the afternoon light. The jewelry was evidence, something that should have been buried with its owner near the shed. Her husband's brother had grown careless, sentimental, dangerous. That evening, after dinner, Catherine disappeared into the master bedroom. From an old trunk, she retrieved an ornate wooden box with brass fittings, a wedding gift from her grandmother. Inside were birth certificates, property deeds, and other papers that secured the Caldwell's position in Mapleton. She added Robert's confession and Janice's locket to this collection, turning the small key in the lock. Insurance, she thought. The box contained everything needed to maintain control, over Thomas, over Robert, over their shared life. Catherine placed it high on a shelf in the bedroom closet, hidden behind winter blankets. When Robert later searched frantically for his hidden envelope, Catherine watched from the doorway. "Looking for something?" she asked softly. The color drained from his face as she approached, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. "Some things are better kept in the right hands, Robert, for everyone's protection." The whispers grew louder around Mapleton as autumn approached. At the general store, conversations would halt when Catherine Caldwell entered, her smile pleasant but her eyes watchful. The arrangement between the brothers and their shared wife had become the town's worst-kept secret, though no one dared speak of it directly. Sheriff Miller's wife claimed she'd seen Catherine and Robert holding hands behind the church after service, their fingers intertwined with an intimacy that went beyond family affection. The postmaster noted how Catherine's letters to Robert, when he briefly visited his cousin in Pittsburgh, carried the same passionate tone as those to Thomas. "It ain't natural," whispered Doris from the diner, leaning across the counter. "That woman's got both men wrapped around her finger tighter than barbed wire." The truth of the Caldwell household remained carefully guarded behind the farmhouse's weathered walls. Their arrangement had begun years before Janice entered the picture, Catherine orchestrating a delicate balance between the brothers, maintaining control through affection and manipulation. Thomas accepted the arrangement, perhaps even encouraged it, believing it kept Robert loyal to the family land. When Robert had mentioned marriage to Janice, the fragile equilibrium shattered. Catherine had smiled sweetly at the dinner table that night, but later, the farmhand heard shouting from the main house. The next morning, Thomas took Robert hunting, returning with hollow eyes and a silent pact renewed. "You belong here," Catherine had whispered to Robert afterward, her hand on his cheek. "With family, with us." The arrangement demanded absolute loyalty, with each member playing their role. Thomas provided authority, Catherine maintained control, and Robert remained caught between desire for freedom and fear of abandonment. When Janice threatened this balance, their collective response had been swift and terrible. Detective Reynolds sensed the unnatural dynamic during his visits to the farm. He noticed how Catherine would position herself between the brothers during questioning, her hand occasionally brushing Robert's arm in reassurance. He observed Thomas's possessive stance, not just toward his wife, but toward his brother as well. "They're hiding something beyond the girl's disappearance," Reynolds confided to his partner. "It's like they're protecting something bigger than themselves." He wasn't wrong. The Caldwells protected their unconventional union with fierce determination. Their pact was sealed in blood now, Janice's disappearance binding them together more tightly than ever before. Any threat to expose their arrangement would mean revealing their collective guilt. The town continued to gossip, but always in hushed tones. The Caldwell family wielded too much influence for anyone to challenge them directly. Their secret remained intact, preserved by fear, respect, and the community's unwillingness to confront the darkness hiding in plain sight. Detective Wayne Reynolds sat in the corner booth of Mapleton's only diner, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee as he slid his worn leather notebook across the table to Officer Jim Benson. The younger man had been asking questions about the Holbrook case, questions that most in the department had long stopped asking. "It's all there," Wayne said, his voice lowered despite the empty diner. 5 years of observations, contradictions, timelines that don't add up, but not a single piece of evidence that would stand up in court. Officer Benson flipped through pages of meticulous notes, detailed accounts of the Caldwell brothers' conflicting statements, Catherine's calculated interventions during questioning, and the curious dynamic that seemed to govern their household. "You really think they did it? All 3 of them?" Benson asked. The detective rubbed his weathered face. "Thomas controls that farm with an iron fist. Robert follows his lead like a shadow. But Catherine, she's the glue holding whatever arrangement they have together." He tapped a page where he'd noted Catherine's odd comment to Linda Holbrook. "Sometimes I wonder if she orchestrated the whole thing." Outside, autumn rain pelted the windows as Wayne described his final interview at the Caldwell property last spring. How Robert had nearly broken down when shown Janice's photograph, only for Catherine to smoothly intervene, her hand on his shoulder, redirecting the conversation with practiced ease. "The town's moved on," Wayne sighed. "The Caldwells donate to every charity function. Catherine chairs the Harvest Festival Committee. Their corn wins ribbons at the county fair. Who wants to believe respected farmers could be involved in something so twisted?" The following week, the department held a retirement party for Detective Reynolds. Speeches celebrated his 30 years of service, cases solved, communities protected. No one mentioned Janice Holbrook or his obsession with the Caldwell family. On his final day, Wayne carefully placed his notebook in his desk drawer. Locking it with a small key, he slipped into his wallet. Perhaps someday, someone with fresh eyes would see what he couldn't prove. That evening, he drove past the Caldwell farm one last time. The grand white farmhouse stood proud against the darkening sky, windows glowing with warm light. He spotted Catherine in the kitchen window, Thomas on the porch, and somewhere inside, Robert. 3 people bound by secrets Wayne couldn't unravel. "I'm sorry, Janice," he whispered as he drove away, the farm receding in his rearview mirror. The case would remain unsolved, the Caldwell's reputation intact. And Janice Holbrook just another missing person file, gathering dust in the archives of Mapleton's small police station. The Caldwell farm prospered through the 80s and 90s, its boundaries swallowing adjacent properties like a slow, methodical predator. Thomas Caldwell invested in modern machinery, transforming their operation into one of the county's most productive. From the outside, success seemed to follow the family like a faithful shadow. The silos stood taller, the barns gleamed with fresh paint, and the fields yielded bounties that made neighboring farmers whisper with envy. Inside the farmhouse, however, time moved differently. Catherine's control over the household had crystallized into something almost supernatural. Now in her 50s, she maintained her appearance with meticulous precision, her hair always perfectly styled before breakfast, her clothes pressed and proper, even for farm chores. Her influence over both brothers had deepened into something resembling ownership. Robert's transformation was the most disturbing. Once merely quiet and reserved, he had become a hollow vessel, moving through the farm like a ghost haunting his own life. His eyes, once bright with the promise that had attracted Janice Holbrook, now stared vacantly at nothing in particular. He spoke only when necessary, his voice a raspy whisper from years of disuse. "Robert needs his rest," Catherine would explain to the rare visitors, her hand possessively gripping his forearm. "The farm takes so much out of him." But locals noticed how he flinched at her touch, how his shoulders hunched protectively whenever Thomas entered a room. The farmhouse itself seemed to absorb the family's secrets. Floorboards that once creaked with the weight of everyday life now groaned with something heavier. Family photographs disappeared from walls, replaced by generic landscapes. The living room, where Catherine once hosted church socials, remained perfectly clean, but perpetually unused. Thomas, approaching 60, had grown more severe with age. His commanding presence had calcified into something brittle and dangerous. Farmhands rarely lasted more than a season, driven away by his unpredictable temper and Catherine's watchful gaze. At night, lights burned in separate windows of the house, Thomas in his study, Catherine in the kitchen, Robert in the small bedroom at the end of the hall. The arrangement, unnatural but established, continued without question or challenge. Detective Reynolds, now retired, occasionally drove past the property, slowing his vehicle to study the farm that had consumed the final years of his career. "Something's buried there," he would mutter to himself. And it isn't just that poor girl. The town of Mapleton evolved around them. New developments, changing faces, but the Caldwell farm remained frozen in amber, a museum of unspoken horrors. Its fields might have been lush with corn and wheat, but within its walls, 3 hearts had withered into barren wastelands of secrets and shame. By the late 90s, Mapleton had transformed from the close-knit farming community it once was. The old general store had been replaced by a mini-mart, and many of the original families had sold their land to developers or moved away entirely. Yet the Caldwell farm stood like a monument to the past, its boundaries unchanged while the world around it shifted. Catherine Caldwell, now in her 60s, maintained her position at the center of the household with unwavering determination. Her once auburn hair had silvered, but her eyes remained sharp, missing nothing. She still attended Grace Lutheran Church every Sunday, though the congregation hardly recognized her anymore. The older parishioners would whisper behind hymnals when she entered. Their memories of Janice Holbrook faded but not forgotten. Robert had become a shell of the man he once was. His shoulders permanently hunched, he rarely ventured beyond the farm's boundaries. Local children created stories about the ghost farmer they sometimes glimpsed working the fields at dusk. He spoke only when necessary, his voice a raspy whisper from years of disuse. Catherine kept him tethered through unspoken threats and shared guilt, their bizarre relationship calcified by time. Thomas's imposing frame had been diminished by heart disease. The farmer who once commanded respect with a single glance now required assistance to climb the porch steps. Doctor visits became more frequent, with Catherine driving the aging pickup into town, always ensuring Robert stayed behind. "Someone needs to watch the property," she would insist, though everyone knew it was to prevent him from speaking freely. New neighbors attempted friendliness at first, bringing casseroles or offering help during harvest. Catherine would accept their offerings with practiced charm before subtly discouraging further contact. The Caldwell mailbox remained at the end of their long gravel driveway, a boundary few dared to cross. Detective Wayne Reynolds had retired years earlier, his notebook of suspicions gathering dust in his attic. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, he would drive past the Caldwell property, wondering what secrets remained buried there. Once, he spotted Robert standing alone in the field, staring at the stars with such longing that Reynolds nearly stopped to speak with him. But the moment passed, and the detective drove on. The Holbrook case had become local legend, the kind of story teenagers told at parties to frighten each other. Few remembered the real Janice, her hopes, her dreams, her blue Ford Pinto. Even fewer suspected how the truth remained locked away in an ornate box in the Caldwell attic, waiting to be discovered by a generation not yet born. As Thomas's health deteriorated, Catherine's control tightened. The farm's prosperity continued, but inside those walls, time stood still, prisoners of a pact none dared to break. In the spring of 2020, Mapleton had changed in countless ways since the 70s. The old cornfields behind the Caldwell property had been sold off to Horizon Developments, a company building modern homes where crops once grew. Construction crews broke ground with heavy machinery, their presence a stark contrast to the weathered farmhouse that still stood as a monument to the past. The foreman, puzzled by unusual readings on his equipment, called in specialists with ground-penetrating radar. The technology, unimaginable in 1976, revealed anomalies beneath the soil near the old toolshed that had once marked the boundary of the Caldwell land. Detective Samantha Reeves, who had inherited Wayne Reynolds' position decades after his retirement, received the call on a rainy Tuesday morning. The aging Reynolds himself, now 83 and living in a care facility outside town, had passed his notebook to her years earlier, whispering that the Caldwell case was the one that got away. "We've found something," the construction manager told her, pointing to the shadowy images on the radar screen. "Something that doesn't belong." The excavation began cautiously, with forensic anthropologists carefully removing each layer of soil. Catherine Caldwell, now a widow twice over, Thomas having passed from heart failure in 2009, and Robert from liver disease just 3 years later, watched from her porch, her once piercing eyes clouded with cataracts but missing nothing. When they unearthed the skeletal remains, the town held its collective breath. Dental records confirmed what many had suspected for 44 years. Janice Holbrook had never left Mapleton. Her bones told a silent story of blunt force trauma to the skull, of hasty burial, and of secrets kept for nearly half a century. Linda Holbrook, now 81 and living in Tampa, received the call she had both dreaded and longed for. Walter had died never knowing what happened to their daughter, but Linda had held on to hope with the tenacity of a mother's heart. "I always knew," she told reporters in a voice worn thin by decades of grief. "I knew when that woman brought me casseroles and spoke about Janice in the past tense. I knew in my heart." The discovery sparked renewed interest in the case. Younger residents of Mapleton, who had only heard whispers of the town's darkest chapter, scrolled through digitized newspaper archives on their phones, piecing together the story that had haunted their parents' generation. Catherine, the last keeper of the Caldwell secrets, refused all interviews. But the truth she had guarded so carefully was finally emerging from the earth itself, like a terrible harvest decades in the planting. The attic of the Caldwell farmhouse revealed its secrets in layers. Investigators moved methodically through decades of accumulated history. Moth-eaten quilts, faded family albums, and cardboard boxes filled with tax receipts yellowed by time. Detective Sophia Martinez, who had inherited Wayne Reynolds' cold case files, directed her team with quiet precision, knowing they were walking through a mausoleum of memories. Behind a false panel in the wall, obscured by an antique dresser, they discovered what Reynolds had suspected existed all along: Catherine Caldwell's ornate wooden box, its brass lock still sturdy despite the years. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with hand-carved roses adorning each corner, a stark contrast to the darkness it contained. "We need to document everything exactly as we find it," Martinez instructed, as a forensic technician carefully picked the lock. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay Janice Holbrook's heart-shaped silver locket, the same one visible in her graduation photo. the one Walter and Linda had described countless times during interviews. The chain was broken, suggesting it had been torn from her neck in struggle. Beneath the jewelry lay Robert's confession, handwritten on lined paper torn from a notebook. His penmanship, shaky and desperate, told the story Reynolds had pieced together decades earlier but could never prove. "I never wanted her gone. Thomas said we had to. She threatened to expose us. Catherine said it would destroy everything we built." Most damning were the letters, dozens of them, documenting the arrangement that had bound the household together. Catherine's neat, controlled handwriting detailed rules for their three-way relationship, schedules for intimacy, and warnings about maintaining appearances in town. Some letters, dating back to before Janice's arrival, revealed how Catherine had methodically manipulated both brothers, playing on Thomas's need for control and Robert's desperate need for affection. One letter, dated just days after Janice's disappearance, contained explicit instructions. "Robert, you must never speak of her again. Remember our pact. What happens in this house stays buried with this house." Martinez closed her eyes briefly, thinking of Reynolds, who had died never knowing how close he'd been to the truth. The detective's notebook, with its careful observations about Catherine's controlling behavior and the brothers' strange dynamic, now seemed prophetic. "Call the district attorney," Martinez told her partner, "and contact the Holbrook family. After 44 years, they deserve to know what really happened to their daughter." The evidence was irrefutable. As word spread through Mapleton, the town's oldest secret, the one they had collectively chosen to ignore, was finally exposed to the light. The trial of Thomas and Catherine Caldwell became the most significant legal proceeding in Mapleton's history. At 83, Thomas Caldwell sat in his wheelchair, a shadow of the commanding figure who once ruled his farm with an iron will. Catherine, 79, maintained her composure even as prosecutors detailed the horrific arrangement that had defined their household for decades. Robert Caldwell had passed away 5 years earlier, taking many secrets to his grave, but leaving behind enough evidence to finally bring justice for Janice Holbrook. The confession found in Catherine's ornate box proved devastating in court. "I never wanted her gone," he had written in shaking handwriting. "Thomas said we had to. She knew too much about us." Walter Holbrook didn't live to see justice served, but Linda, now in her 80s, sat in the front row every day of the trial. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, she closed her eyes and whispered her daughter's name. Detective Wayne Reynolds, long retired, testified about his suspicions that had haunted him for decades. "I knew something wasn't right in that house," he told the packed courtroom. The way Catherine positioned herself between those brothers, how she answered questions before they could speak. But knowing and proving were two different things back then. The residents of Mapleton struggled to reconcile their memories of the respected farming family with the disturbing reality. Former neighbors recalled warning signs they had dismissed: Catherine's possessive behavior toward both men, the brothers' strange dynamic, and the isolated nature of their household. Many admitted they had chosen comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable questions. Forensic evidence revealed that Janice had been killed the very night she visited the farm. She had discovered the true nature of the relationship between the three Caldwells, a sexual arrangement where Catherine maintained intimate relations with both brothers, with Thomas's full knowledge and participation. When Janice threatened to expose them, she was silenced permanently. The media descended upon the small Pennsylvania town, with documentaries and books exploring how such a secret could remain hidden for 44 years. Psychologists analyzed the power dynamic that had bound the three Caldwells together in their terrible pact. For the younger generation of Mapleton, the case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of small-town silence. "We don't look away anymore," said the current pastor of Grace Lutheran Church during a memorial service for Janice. We ask questions. We speak up. As Thomas and Catherine began serving their life sentences, the Caldwell farm was sold, its proceeds going to a victims' advocacy fund established in Janice Holbrook's name. The fields where dark secrets once grew now stand as a memorial to truth, however delayed, however painful, finally coming to light.